Few friendships in the history of popular music carry as much weight, warmth, and quiet heartbreak as the one shared by Paul McCartney and George Harrison. Two boys from Liverpool who bonded over guitars and American rock, records grew into men whose partnership helped define an era, even as fame, ego, and creative ambition pulled them apart in ways neither fully admitted at the time. Decades later, McCartney has spoken more openly about what really happened between them. The loyalty, the resentment, the unspoken love, and the picture that emerges is far more layered than the tidy Beatles mythology most fans grew up with. To the outside world, the bond between Paul and George looked effortless, the kind of brotherhood built to last. But underneath, tension had been building for years, quietly reshaping a friendship that once felt unbreakable. Paul was confident and assertive, the kind of person who naturally stepped into a leadership role and became the band's driving creative force. George, meanwhile, was gifted but often overlooked, constantly searching for room to express his own artistic voice inside a group where two other strong personalities already dominated the songwriting. As their ambitions diverged, so did their temperaments. Paul's exacting perfectionist streak collided with George's growing pull toward independence and spiritual searching, and the friction seeped into the personal relationship the two men had built since childhood. Audiences only ever saw the polished songs and smiling photographs, never the quiet frustration underneath. That strain became impossible to miss during recording sessions, where Paul often took charge and directed the other musicians in a way that visibly irritated George. In one raw moment, George told Paul he would play exactly what was wanted of him, or not play at all, a rare crack in the polite exterior that revealed just how much resentment had built up. Years of watching his songs push to the margins while Lennon-McCartney compositions took priority had worn on him, and that imbalance sowed a bitterness that would take decades to resolve. Yet for all that private frustration, neither man said much about it publicly for years, keeping up a friendly public face while something far more complicated simmered underneath. None of this defined the whole relationship, though. Even during the roughest patches, Paul continued to act as something of a mentor and champion for George, especially in the earlier years. That contradiction, real support tangled up with real rivalry, made their story more complicated than a simple falling out. To understand how two such different personalities ended up so entwined, it helps to go back to where it all began. Liverpool in the mid-1950s. Paul and George first crossed paths around 1954 at the Liverpool Institute High School for Boys. Paul, a year older, was already known for his sharp wit and musical curiosity, while George was quieter and never quite comfortable with the rigid structure of school life. Their friendship wasn't built in the classroom. It grew on the long bus rides into the city, where Paul would bring his guitar and George, drawn in by the instrument, struck up a conversation about music that reportedly stretched on for hours. Both boys were swept up in the skiffle craze that had made its way over from America, a simple, energetic style that inspired a whole generation of teenagers to pick up instruments for the first time. Their musical tastes were shaped early by American rock and roll. Elvis Presley, Buddy Holly, Little Richard. George was especially struck by the raw energy of Heartbreak Hotel, and it pushed him to practice harder, sketching guitars in his school notebooks and playing until his fingers ached. Paul, for his part, had grown up around music through his father, a jazz band leader, and had already trained on piano by the time he met George, even as he was beginning to build his own guitar skills. Paul recognized something in George's dedication early on, sensing that the younger boy's persistence would eventually pay off. Their shared devotion to music created an almost immediate bond between them. By 1956, George was playing in a local skiffle group called the Rebels, already showing signs that music would be more than a passing hobby. A year later, Paul joined John Lennon's band, the Quarrymen, kicking off a partnership that would eventually reshape popular music. Paul believed George had the talent to join as a second guitarist, but Lennon was initially reluctant, thinking George looked too young to fit the image of the group. George settled the question himself, reportedly nailing a performance of the rockabilly instrumental Raunchy on a bus, which was enough to convince the others and complete the lineup. From there, the three young musicians spent countless hours together, working out chords and dreaming about a future beyond Liverpool. For Paul, who had lost his mother at 14, this circle of friends offered something like a lifeline. For George, It was proof that he belonged among more experienced musicians as an equal. As the Beatles rocketed from local favorites to global phenomenon, the pressure on both the band and the friendships within it intensified. By the mid-1960s, Paul had firmly established himself as the group's creative engine, and while that drive shaped much of the band's sound, it also left George feeling increasingly sidelined. He was no longer simply the quiet one. He was developing into a genuine songwriter with his own voice, but the dominant Lennon-McCartney partnership meant his contributions were frequently overlooked. That imbalance began to affect more than studio schedules. It started to wear on the personal relationship as well. The tension became especially clear during the making of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1967, an album largely regarded as Paul's vision. George's contribution, Within You Without You, reflected his deepening interest in Indian music and philosophy, but to Paul and the rest of the band it registered as just another track on a larger concept record. To George, it meant something much more personal, a symbol of his search for meaning beyond commercial success. Their priorities were quietly diverging, one chasing records and business, the other searching for a spiritual path, and the gap between them kept widening. That divide reached a turning point during the Beatles' trip to India in early 1968. George threw himself fully into meditation, treating the experience as genuinely life-changing, while Paul approached it more casually, more like a working break than a spiritual awakening. A light-hearted comment from Paul telling George to calm down only underscored how differently they viewed the same experience. For George, it was no joke at all. As the band's obsession with recording and success pulled focus away from what George considered essential to his well-being, his frustration deepened. And George's songwriting during this period grew richer and more introspective, even as much of it kept getting pushed aside. By 1969, the strain reached its breaking point during the sessions for what would become the Let It Be album. Cameras captured a band that no longer felt unified, and the friction between Paul and George was especially visible, with Paul frequently directing the studio in ways George experienced as stifling. In one raw exchange, George told Paul he'd play whatever pleased him or not play at all, a moment that reflected years of frustration finally spilling over. George had quietly built up a stockpile of his own songs, including what would become All Things Must Pass, Isn't a Pity, and Run of the Mill, material the band routinely passed over in favor of Lennon-McCartney songs. On January 10th, 1969, George reached his limit and walked out of rehearsals, later describing the atmosphere as deeply unhealthy for him. He stayed away for 12 days before returning, but the underlying fractures never fully healed. The song Wah Wah, written the day he left, captured exactly how he felt about the tension Paul's dominant presence had created. Around that same time, in a private conversation later recounted by writer Anthony Fawcett, Paul told John that George's songwriting had finally caught up to their own, a comment George dismissed, pointing out that he'd been writing at that level for years already. The gap in how each man saw the situation was telling. Paul viewed George as a late bloomer who had only recently matched their pace, while George felt Paul had simply never been willing to share creative space. That fundamental disagreement fed the rivalry and left real emotional scars, later surfacing in lyrics like those of Run of the Mill, which seemed to speak directly to the wound of a broken friendship. Even amid all that conflict, 1969 also gave George one of his greatest triumphs within the band. During the recording of Abbey Road, he delivered two of the record's most beloved songs, Here Comes the Sun and Something. Something in particular became an instant classic. Frank Sinatra later called it one of the greatest love songs ever written, and even John Lennon considered it the best track on the album. For George, the acclaim felt like long overdue validation, proof that he was far more than the band's guitarist. Yet even this success brought new friction, as George grew tired of what he saw as Paul's constant interference, and Paul, in turn, felt his own leadership position being quietly challenged. Abbey Road turned out to be their final recorded album together, and the group formally split in 1970. Both men moved forward quickly. George released a sprawling triple album All Things Must Pass in 1970, proving just how much material he'd been sitting on, while Paul released his self-titled solo debut and soon after formed Wings. Their competitive streak didn't disappear with the band. If anything, it followed them into their solo careers. Throughout the 1970s, their friendship remained inconsistent, warm one moment and cold the next. George admitted he found Paul's personality overwhelming and said he could imagine playing music again with John, but not with Paul. Paul, for his part, kept a composed public face even when comments like that stung privately. There was a glimmer of a thaw when George invited Paul to join the concert for Bangladesh in 1971, but Paul turned it down over logistical concerns, and that particular opportunity for reconciliation slipped away. Across the decade that followed, the two men built separate identities. George immersing himself in spirituality and richly textured solo albums, Paul pursuing commercial success with Wings, but the shared history between them never really faded. George stayed candid about how difficult he found Paul's personality, while Paul gradually began to publicly credit George's songwriting. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it marked a real softening. That slow thaw eventually led to a brief, imperfect reunion in the 1990s. On February 11, 1994, Paul, George, and Ringo Starr came together at Paul's studio to work on unfinished John Lennon demos, a session the press nicknamed the Threedles. Old patterns resurfaced almost immediately. George arrived insisting they bring in his friend Jeff Lynne to produce, warning that without outside guidance the sessions risked turning chaotic given the egos involved. The collaboration produced 2 new tracks, Free as a Bird and Real Love, but familiar creative disagreements returned, with Paul wanting a more classic Beatles sound and George favoring something simpler. Even 3 decades on, their artistic instincts still didn't fully align, though the work itself became a genuine bridge between their past and present. Not long after, George's health began to decline. He was diagnosed with throat cancer in 1997, later facing lung cancer and a brain tumor, and in 1999, he survived a violent knife attack at his home that left him weaker but spiritually undiminished. As his condition worsened, Paul made a point of visiting him, and the relationship softened into something quieter and more tender than in their younger years. Paul later described sitting with George for hours in a New York hospital, trading jokes as if they were kids again, and at one point the two even held hands. Something neither would have imagined doing back in Liverpool, a small gesture that spoke to years of unspoken healing. George Harrison died on November 29, 2001, at the age of 58. His ashes were scattered in the Ganges and Yamuna rivers, honoring the Hindu spirituality that had guided so much of his later life. His death was a profound loss for Paul, not just the loss of a bandmate, but of a lifelong friend who had walked beside him since they were teenagers on a Liverpool bus. In the years since, Paul has found quiet ways to keep George's memory close, from greeting a tree George once planted near his home to nurturing a friendship between their children. What began as 2 boys bonding over guitars became one of the most complicated, competitive, and ultimately loving relationships in music history. Proof that even friendships strained by fame, ego, and years of silence can still find their way back to something real.